Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome very much to this evening's Oxford Economic Society talk. This evening we have Michael Ross, Professor of Political Science at UCLA, talking to us about the Twilight of the Orcas, which I'm very excited to hear about. Feel free to send in any questions on the Pigeonhole link posted on the event page. And also remember to join us on Friday at 5 o'clock for Professor Richard Wolff, who will be talking to us about crises of US capitalism. Michael, whenever you are ready, please feel free to share your slides, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. How shall we deal with the questions? Do they appear in the chat, or do you want to field them when they appear?
They'll come through me. So
okay.
If it's okay, well, you can do your talk, and then I will ask you the questions at the end. We'll have a Q&A section then.
Okay, that sounds good. Good. Well, thanks for inviting me. It is 9 in the morning here, so a perfect time to talk about the twilight of the resource curse. So, as you might know, the oil industry, as we know it, began just about 160 years ago with drilling in the United States and in Pennsylvania, in what's now Azerbaijan, near Baku, and has evolved, of course, into the industry we know today, one of the most economically important and technologically sophisticated industries in the world. It has transformed our landscapes. We are deeply dependent on this oil, and often in ways that people don't fully appreciate. The world of agriculture, for example, was transformed by the availability of chemical fertilizers derived from petroleum byproducts, as well as today insecticides that are made from petroleum byproducts as well, essentially making it possible to support the 7, almost 8 billion people on the planet. Just about everything that we run into that has some plastic component, from probably some of the materials you are wearing. I happen to be particularly fond of a aortic heart valve that I have that is made of petroleum products. So it is embedded in our lives in a way that we often forget because it's so indeed ubiquitous. Of course, I'm a political scientist, and I'm going to talk today about the political side of this, political consequences of petroleum abundance, and not for the consuming countries and consumers so much as for the producers. People who don't spend a lot of time thinking about this industry might just associate automatically the oil industry with a handful of places in the world, typically, the Middle East, and maybe, North Sea oil or something in Texas. But it's useful for setting the stage for this analysis to remember that it's actually quite widespread. Proved oil reserves are literally in every region of the world, sometimes with significant abundance. And the economies of 44 countries are dependent on the export of oil and gas and their refined components. It is the top export of countries in the Americas, in Africa, across Asia, of course, the former Soviet Union. Just looking more specifically at the 30 countries that are most economically dependent on oil and gas exports, ranked here by that dependence. It's just worth noting for the moment that 11 of these countries are in the Middle East and North Africa. 7 are in sub-Saharan Africa. 5 are in Latin America. And 4 in the former Soviet Union, including, of course, Russia. Okay. So when we talk about the economic and the political consequences of dependence on oil exports, we are talking about countries everywhere, a very significant subset of the world's countries. And we're talking about one of the world's biggest industries, of course, albeit one that is in crisis at the moment, and whose future, as you might imagine, is particularly cloudy. So today, I thought what I would do is give you a overview, an introduction to some research done partly by me, but also now by many other scholars who work in this area, on some of the political consequences of oil wealth, how it affects governments, what some of the major sort of areas of knowledge are in this, how it typically makes governments larger, less democratic, more corrupt, and actually more patriarchal, that is, with fewer labor market opportunities for women. And then I'll in the second part of the talk, have some speculation about the future of oil politics and how this might change how these countries are going to be affected by the energy transition away from fossil fuels. I'll talk a little bit about stranded assets and what some of their consequences might be, raise some questions about how these countries will fare in a world that is less dependent on their main export, on their main product, and try to throw some cold water on the most common reaction of observers who are faced with these questions, and they say, well, the answer is obviously to diversify, just start making other things. And that's just not so easy. And I'll try to say a little bit more about what those constraints look like. So I'm pleased today to be addressing a group that is sophisticated in its thinking about methods. So let me just mention some of the research challenges in trying to study this area. We, first of all, are faced with relatively small numbers, a small n problem. If we just say, just thinking in the simplest terms, roughly 40 states that are deeply affected by oil wealth, a somewhat larger number of non-oil states. We can look back over the past 50 or 60 years of history, but we still have kind of a small number of observations to be really confident in our inferences from these data. Of course, oil is not randomly distributed, or to be more specific, perhaps oil is randomly distributed around the world. Countries are just sort of randomly assigned different geologies, if you will. But even if that were true, we know it's not true that oil production is randomly assigned around the world. That is, just because you have oil deposits doesn't mean that you're actually going to be able to attract the capital and put together the necessary resources to extract it. If you are extracting it, whether or not you're dependent on that oil is also not randomly assigned and not exogenous to this issue. A country that has rather little oil, like Chad, is much more dependent on oil than a country, in fact, that is today the world's largest oil producer, the United States, which is not economically dependent because the economy is so large. So we have to think seriously about some of the constraints in the analysis imposed by this fact. Another handy trick, and for those of you who are sort of just sort of kind of randomly looking at associations between oil and various outcomes, and many scholars do this, in fact, you might notice that there are many ways to measure the effects of oil by looking at different versions of oil as an independent variable. We could look at a country's oil reserves, its oil production, the revenues from this oil. We could normalize these by per capita or by GDP. We can look at economic dependence on oil revenue, dependence on oil exports. All of these are used as independent variables in analyses in this literature. And of course, people wind up, consciously or not, selecting a measure that might produce the outcome that they feel is most publishable or most interesting or most in keeping with their expectations. So we also have to be, if we're going to do a serious analysis, we have to be careful about how we select our independent variable. We also have to be realistic about the fact that some of the most important quantities of interest in any analysis here are opaque. It's very hard to measure, for example, the country's oil revenues, particularly when they are filtered through a national oil company, which are themselves notoriously opaque. And if you read enough of the literature in this area, you may also notice that a lot of the key variables, the things that people believe are, for example, important conditioning factors or important outcomes, things like the rule of law and property rights, government revenues, many of these things are collinear. And so you can develop your own, pet theory about why oil has certain effects in one country, certain effects in another country, and show that it's consistent with the data, partly because a lot of the key variables don't look that different from each other. And you can find similar associations with many different versions of, for example, government performance or good governance. Now, there has been evolution over time and sophistication of research in this area. The sort of simpler and earlier versions that I was initially involved in involved just simple sort of cross-national time series regressions of country-level data. Now we use, for example, instrumental variables, try to find some sort of instrument for a country's oil production or abundance or dependence. Some studies, some of the best recent studies, in fact, one of my favorite recent studies looks at geographic discontinuities. And actually the lead authors are economists who got their PhDs at Oxford, Jim Cust and Torfinn Harding, a new piece out in the Journal of the European Economic Association that exploits the fact that oil fields around the world are often found in the boundary areas between countries or along various borders, and hence, if we assume that the border is sort of arbitrarily situated with respect to the oil wealth, and this is typically the case because borders are often set before oil is known about, we can we can look at what the conditions are that explain why you have different levels of production, different investment in one side than in the other. And this discontinuity can actually give us a lot of insight into why we see certain outcomes. So this is just to give you sort of a flavor of the academic kind of research side of this and some of the things that we argue about in the literature. Okay. What I'm going to show you today is a lot of it is based on econometric analyses of one kind or another. Some of it's based on my own work, some of it's based on work of other people and other organizations. But I thought I would just sort of present some stylized facts and some kind of some broad patterns to think about sort of from a public policy perspective. So, oh, also I forgot to mention that that some dimensions of the resource curse are subnational. For example, armed conflict. Armed conflict is typically located in some specific geographic terrain within a country, and we can hence use other kinds of discontinuities to study sort of as a natural experiment the effects of commodity prices, commodity price shocks on conflict and different conflict indicators. Okay, recent meta-analysis of these does find a strong effect. Okay, all right. So what do we know about the political consequences of oil wealth, of finding oil? Obviously, oil wealth generates a lot of income. Oil rents can be enormous. And if you think for just a moment about sort of the quasi-randomness in the distribution of oil-bearing rock, you quickly realize that that some places that are probably quite unprepared, if you will, for large revenue shocks upon the exploitation of their oil are going to be, in fact, overwhelmed with revenue. And this has a lot of interesting effects. You might naively say, well, oil discoveries lead to economic booms, and of course that's true. But it might be a little bit more accurate to note that oil discoveries also lead to, or predominantly to, booms in government and government spending. Oil is as a subsoil resource is almost everywhere. The United States is a big exception, but almost everywhere government owned. Okay, if oil is found, if oil is discovered wherever it is within a country, government claims ownership, claims a royalty, has control over concessions that exploit it, and so a lot of the revenues are flowing into the central government, and not surprisingly, the governments of oil-producing countries do tend to be much larger than, for example, the governments in neighboring countries that don't have oil. And this is just some simple examples. It is incidentally hard to measure sometimes the size of government. You have to be sort of a little bit suspicious of figures that you get and look at them carefully. But just by way of simple comparisons, you can look at, for example, Nigeria, Azerbaijan, Venezuela, Iran, Algeria, their revenues compared to the revenues of their neighbors. So that is specifically in government spending. Okay. Of course, a lot of this revenue is filtered through or captured by national oil companies, NOCs, which dominate much of the landscape of oil production and oil trading, and perhaps less obviously, they are political powerhouses within their own countries. They are not infrequently closely controlled by whoever controls the government. They can be sometimes Well, I'm not really sure. Saudi Aramco is often sort of colloquially understood as this highly competent organization, and kind of the organization in Saudi Arabia that really functions well. But that perception probably has a lot to do with its opacity. I think the closer you look, the more you find, let's just say, anomalies in the revenue and how it's distributed. In any case, these are sort of the major economic and political players in the landscape of many oil-rich countries, most oil-rich countries. Well, one consequence of having all this revenue is that oil producers are much less likely to be democratic than their non-oil neighbors and counterparts. Now, this is something that there has been a lot of research on, literally thousands of studies now. There's certainly some debates about it, but I think, in my view, the association is so strong that you can see it just sort of eyeballing the data in many ways. For example, look at this list of 30 countries, the 30 most dependent. Of these 30, 23 are autocracies, just 7 are democracies, and some of those democracies not functioning terribly well. Okay, this in a world where, let's say, roughly half of all countries are democratic. Now, I should say parenthetically that this used to be, a particularly interesting fact when the world was getting more democratic, because the oil producers were sort of the hardcore autocracies, the hardcore dictatorships. And as more and more states became democratic, they occupied a larger and larger fraction of the world's remaining autocracies. And so this became particularly prominent, and people who worried about, obstacles to democracy and democratization became especially interested in how oil might be hindering transitions to democracy. Of course, now in the last decade, we live in a world where democracy is in retreat. And so the oil-producing countries are getting many more, neighbors who are also undemocratic. But this nonetheless seems to be a consistent pattern. Okay, and you can look at the data, the various ways to analyze it. This here shows oil income per capita on the horizontal axis, all countries listed, most countries having little or no oil produced per capita. There's not dependence on oil, this is just how much oil there is on a per capita basis. And then I ask for each country, how much of its life has it been democratic? Has it been for 0 years, or 0% of its life, or 100% of its life? Okay, how much time has it been under democratic rule? And you can see that the countries with the most oil have been consistently undemocratic. And hence we do have this very strong relationship between oil abundance and lack of democracy. Okay. And it stands out, I think, also in just the sort of casual look around the world at the countries that are sort of big oil powers and how they're governed. Of course, think of Russia, think of Saudi Arabia, and really all the countries in the Saudi Peninsula, North America, Venezuela, along the sort of most enduring democracy in Latin America until Hugo Chavez is elected in 1999, and it begins to deteriorate into something quite undemocratic today. So why is this? What explains this, this pattern? There are many ways to study it. I'd be happy to address that if you have questions about it. But I think it does come down to a handful of mechanisms that are, in my subjective opinion, the most consistent and intuitively sensible pathways that connect oil wealth and lack of democracy. The first is lower taxes. Now we see this in the non-oil world too, which is part of what gives me confidence that this is an important mechanism. More oil revenues, the lower taxes on direct taxes on citizens. And there is this very strong pattern that when taxes are raised, people demand more accountability of their government. It's true historically in Europe, for example, but it's true around the world today, and it's very much true in the oil-producing world, I think, where governments essentially buy the loyalty of their citizens by not bothering them for taxes and simply accumulating this very opaque source of revenue and spending it without much oversight or accountability. Of course, it's not just the revenue that comes in. Governments, as they are quite large and well-funded, typically have a lot of money for patronage. They often dominate the sort of overshadow the private sector. Government jobs are highly sought after, often well compensated, might not involve much work. And this is another key mechanism for ensuring political loyalty. There is probably more repression, and you might think of this as the oil revenues being so abundant that governments are able to secure the loyalty of the armed services and the armed forces in a way that maybe they can't so well in other countries. And by keeping the military quite loyal, it can use armed forces in a whole range of ways to intimidate the population and ensure that that there are no challengers for its for the government's incumbency. Okay. Lots of research on oil and corruption. None of this should be surprising to economists. In fact, it seems so straightforward. I'm going to not say any more about it and skip it, and talk about something that's perhaps a little bit less obvious, but I think relevant and underappreciated, which is that oil wealth tends to have a strong effect on labor force participation and ultimately political participation by women. Okay, it has a strong gendered effect. Why is that, and how could this be? If you look around the world, you do see that in the Middle East and North Africa, largely Muslim, not exclusively, that labor force participation rates are lower. But this is typically attributed to some sort of Islamic or Arabic cultural influence. And I think this was the assumption for a long time, but research that I've done suggests that, in fact, that's only part of the story. There are many Islamic countries where you don't have low labor force participation. And if you compare within the Arab world, those countries with abundant oil and those countries with little or no oil, you find many fewer women in the workforce and fewer women as a fraction of the workforce in the oil producers than in the non-oil producers. And I think it has a lot to do with the simple fact that when women enter the labor force in the formal sector, when women get that first entry point and begin to earn incomes in their own name, it is most commonly in low-wage manufacturing, in fact, low-wage export-oriented manufacturing, sweatshops, often the textile industry. And this is true, it's true historically, it's true in the Industrial Revolution, it's true in the United States, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's true today. And there's lots of evidence that having these jobs, having this employment, even in the garment industry, has many, many consequences, including for political empowerment. In Bangladesh, for example, women who work in factories are more exposed to each other. They begin to form labor unions, they begin to form organizations that protect their interests and share information. If you know something about Bangladesh, you know that, that the garment industry is overwhelmingly employing women, that it dominates the economy. It's an enormous sector. And I think, in my view, it's no coincidence that you have women at the top of the political system, even though this is a Muslim country, not just in the governing party, but in the opposition party. This has been true for quite some time. So, why does this matter for oil? It matters because of the Dutch disease. So, just put together two facts. First, what I've mentioned, that low-wage manufacturing is typically the entry point into the formal sector for women, and that we find this broadly internationally. It's true in East Asia, it's true in lots and lots of places. And that oil production through the Dutch disease crowds out low-wage manufacturing, right? It's cheaper to import than to export these kinds of goods if you've got a lot of oil. And you're unable to compete internationally with your factory jobs, with your products. And because these sectors are crowded out by the Dutch disease, you have fewer economic and political opportunities for women. Okay. And I think this actually goes quite far in helping understand the slow progress of women into the labor force and also into politics in the Middle East. And there's much more to say about this. I could talk about my research and other people's research on this. The patterns are quite consistent. Just looking at the countries of the Middle East, there's this very strong association between how much oil rents are available in the country and when, if at all, women are granted suffrage. There's a very strong association between oil and the number of women in the labor force, strong association between oil and the number of parliamentary seats or the number of cabinet positions held by women. Some of this is changing, albeit somewhat slowly, but the pattern, I think, still holds. Okay, and you can see it also if you sort of zero in on countries, for example, comparing Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Otherwise similar, French colonial history, all three trying to get their textile industries going for many years. But Tunisia much more successful and Morocco more successful than Algeria. Why? Wages in Algeria were much higher, okay, and they had a much more difficult time producing competitive products, okay. And Algeria sort of failed again and again in getting this industry going. In Tunisia, it became the biggest employer of women entering the labor force, okay, and quite a successful export industry. Okay, let me talk for the last 10 minutes or so about the future of the oil industry, because you might think if we are transitioning to a world less dependent on oil, that oil might become less of a problem in these countries if increases in oil production lead to these harmful outcomes. Shouldn't a decline in oil production lead to the reversal? Okay, shouldn't it make it easier for these countries to democratize, reduce corruption, open more space for the private sector and for women in the labor market? Okay, it's not so clear. One reason it's not so clear is that we don't really know what the future of the oil market will look like. Just looking at 2020 compared to 2019, this is just recent data from the International Energy Agency. Demand for coal, gas, oil, all down substantially from 2019. Only renewables see some increase in demand. Oil down particularly far. Okay. Investment in oil, however, investment in the energy sector is way down. Okay. And that could have consequences for the oil price going forward. Even if you're going to face a world of declining oil production, you need investment to keep oil fields productive. And without that investment, you're going to have less oil produced, higher prices for the set demand. Now, the IEA looks at alternative scenarios for demand for oil and gas. In the so-called stated policies scenario, that is, we imagine countries sort of on a glide path, adhering to the policies they claim they will implement. In 2040, we might see about a 25% reduction in oil and gas production. If instead we move to a greener world and their so-called sustainable development scenario, we might see a 60% reduction from 2019 levels. And so a much bigger change. But we really just don't have much luck in the past in predicting oil production, oil demand, oil prices. Oil, which is the top line here, has been increasing in production for a very long time. Perhaps we are at peak oil demand now, but perhaps not. The world is full of surprises. So that's just to say that I'm going to be making some strong assumptions in suggesting that we think about reduced oil production and lower prices, because it may not turn out that way. Okay. It does seem, though, that in the new world of oil, that a lot of the identified reserves can't be exploited and won't be exploited. And this means that both private and state-owned companies will have significant stranded assets. And it's going to be a particular problem for oil-dependent governments for a number of reasons. Okay, and I'm going to draw a little bit on a wonderful recent paper by David Manley and Patrick Heller, issued by the Natural Resources Governance Institute, that looked at stranded assets and national oil companies. It pointed out, among other things, that many of the oil producers in the world have still, even in the moment of energy transition, very high break-even prices. That is, they base their budgets on the assumption that the price will be at a certain level each year. And sometimes these prices are very high, and around $124 a barrel, more than twice the actual price today. Okay, so there's a range of assumptions here, but you can just quickly understand that many countries are going to be in fiscal trouble. And you might also notice that the value of national oil companies, those that are listed, and the listed ones are probably the better managed ones, those share prices have been dropping for a decade. Okay, they are the darker line here, the sort of chunky line, compared to the S&P 500 going up. or excuse me, the NOC price is the orange line here. You can see drifting down. The other line is the oil price. Okay. So what happens when oil revenues fall? Okay. Certainly we're going to expect fewer government jobs, less patronage, but from looking at periods of oil decline in the past, particularly in the 1990s, we know that in some cases, yes, this could weaken the government and allow the opposition enough influence to force a democratic transition, as we saw in Nigeria and Mexico. But it could also lead to conflict and regime collapse and be quite ugly. When dictators fall, they're often replaced by other dictators. It can be, of course, a very violent and tragic process. Libya still in the midst of civil war, and really no settlement that I can tell on the horizon since the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. Venezuela, despite this ridiculous, extreme inflation and fiscal crisis, the regime lives on, albeit with the people under greater and greater distress. So why not just diversify, you might say? Okay, diversification is sort of like the magic dust that analysts like to sprinkle on top of this problem. It's the word that just sounds so good, like sort of like sustainable development. Like let's just add a little bit of sustainability to this, and we'll solve the problem. Okay, there's a reason why we see very little diversification in the oil-producing countries. The Dutch disease is very real, and it's a very strong pattern. It's extremely hard for governments to move out of the oil sector and find other sectors where they can specialize and diversify their exports, even diversify their domestic economy. If you look at the best available measures of export concentration, I've divided the world into three. The red line represents the oil-producing countries, okay, back since 1960. My data unfortunately end in 2010, but I think this is, I'm pretty confident that this pattern continues. Blue is the rest of the world, the non-oil countries, and green are the mineral-producing countries. And the basic fact is that while the rest of the world has become more diversified, oil-producing countries have not. Okay, and the gap between oil producers and non-oil producers has grown, in fact, on this measure of export diversification. It's particularly worrisome in Africa. If you compare Africa's non-oil economies and its oil economies growing more concentrated, non-oil economies growing more diverse. I don't really have time to explain all the figures. I wasn't sure how long I would go. But if you look at the countries of the world and how much their export concentration has changed from 1995 to 2010, they're sort of scattered around a 45-degree line, some more, some less diversified. But once you add the oil producers, the red dots, you see that they have been systematically different. All right, so what does all this mean? So we have to say parenthetically, there's lots of uncertainty about oil demand. But stranded assets and diversification are going to be a special problem for national oil companies. It's one thing for a Shell or Exxon or Chevron to diversify. These are big companies, they're sophisticated. They, at least theoretically, can do it. It's another if you are the national oil company and you are in charge of a government's assets. There are many political interests associated with those assets. There may be no skills available to move into other sectors. These countries really are facing a very worrisome future. It could lead to some democratization, but declining revenues may also just lead to state collapse. It could be more Libya's than Mexico's. And unfortunately, diversification is really quite rare. It's important to remember this is not a small number of countries. They are distributed globally, and when they suffer, so does the rest of the world. Okay, why don't I stop there? We're right at the 45-minute point, as far as I can tell. I'd be happy to take questions or any thoughts. Are you muted?
Yes, sorry about that. Sorry, I was just saying thank you very much. That was very insightful. Cheers for alerting me to that. So the first question is one for myself, actually. So I was just wondering about what you see as the future in terms of renewable energy and whether there could be a form of renewable energy dependency. So the countries that become the leading producers, the leading exporters of renewable forms of energy, whether the markets and the country's experience will be similar to what's happened with oil, sort of similar fluctuations, similar issues facing them due to sort of, as in effectively it's asking, is this an issue with the energy industry in general, or is it specific to oil itself?
Right. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's really specific to oil. It's really specific to oil and gas. I don't see significant rents generated by the renewable energy sector. You don't tend to have this market dominance. That is, it's not obvious that there are large economies of scale in the same way, such that you will have energy monopolies dominating the market, which could again create rents. There's lots of competition, at least at this point. Different types of renewable energy are competing and available. That's good also for driving down these rents. And it does tend to be more localized. It's not clear that you're going to have this enormous international energy trade in the future. Countries all seem to have one source or another of renewable energy potentially available to them. So I think it could be that a large part of the world's trade may disappear or erode, really, since it won't truly disappear. But whereas energy constitutes this very large fraction of traded goods, that may not be true in a world dependent on renewables.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a really interesting answer. So next question would be how influential you would say OPEC is in the oil industry today. Obviously, as you discussed, the United States is now the biggest producer of oil of any nation and is not a member of OPEC. So historically, why has the influence of OPEC declined so greatly? And also, why has the United States seen so much success in the production of oil in recent years? Okay,
so two interesting questions. OPEC, I think, is kind of a fig leaf. It's actually much less influential than people commonly think. OPEC is really the sort of window dressing that Saudi Arabia likes to keep in place. But Saudi Arabia is really the only country that can keep OPEC together. It's the country that will cut back significantly on its production if it sees that it, wishes to stabilize the price. So I think we give far too much influence to OPEC. Really, since the 1970s, it's hard to find instances where OPEC has really made a difference in the price, except maybe in the very, very short run. So Saudi Arabia does matter. The United States matters, but it's you don't have a national oil company. You don't have a centralized producer of oil and much sort of political control over how much is produced, and that makes it difficult for the United States to kind of deploy its oil production strategically in a political way, much as Donald Trump would like to think otherwise. He seems to sort of feel like he personally derives great stature from U.S. oil production, but it's highly decentralized. I think the short answer to why you have this boom in production in the United States, there is technological innovation, of course, with hydraulic fracturing and other technologies that made it possible to extract a lot more. But why in the United States and not in other countries whose geology is similar? Basically has to do with property rights. It is a very decentralized, privatized system. Subsoil assets can be privately owned. And so you're able to have a much more nimble, albeit politically messy and maybe environmentally disastrous response from the industry than you could have in, say, France or Argentina.
Okay, that's very interesting. So following on from that, what do you think the influence of a Biden presidency might be on the state of affairs of the oil industry in the United States and globally as well, I suppose?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I think you know, for Americans, it matters a lot in that there'll be a greater effort to preserve federal lands and reduce or prevent drilling in federal properties. But that is only a fraction of the oil market. And production rises and falls much more due to fluctuations in global markets, basically demand and supply, which is, of course, far beyond the capacity of the president to influence. So, you know, Donald Trump liked to sort of imagine that he was, you know, kind of in charge of the expansion of the oil industry. But that was really, you know, not very much due to him. He was able to sell off drilling rights on some federal lands, but a lot of that drilling never happened because demand has been dropping since 2014, really. It's not quite true. Demand hasn't fallen. The price has fallen as supply has effectively outstripped demand. And so I don't think that the effect will be huge. I certainly hope there's much stricter imposition of oil field practices. There's a lot of methane release. The Obama administration was on the cusp of imposing fairly strict regulations on natural gas production, oil production, to keep that methane from being released. Of course, the global heating potential of methane is catastrophic. Trump stopped those regulations. I very much hope Biden reimposes them.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much again. Another really insightful answer. So just changing tack slightly to one of the submitted questions. What are your views on the Saudi Vision 2030?
Well, so putting aside for a moment any feelings I might have about the Saudi government itself, and looking just purely at the economic dimension of it, this is, of course, this very big push to diversify the economy and kind of modernize it. The government has taken steps that surprised me. I'm very, very much surprised at this effort to cut back on government jobs and help develop the private sector. That said, if you look back, so in August 2014, there was this kind of crash in oil prices. Oil prices have never really recovered since then. And that began a lot of noise about diversification in literally every oil producing country that I know. All of the leaders of these countries, all politicians said, you know, we have to diversify, the end of oil is near. Saudi's plans were more aggressive. They may have gone further in implementing them. I still am very skeptical about their ability to succeed. And on top of that, it's ironic because of all the countries in the world, produce oil, Saudi Arabia probably is going to be the last oil producer on the planet, and has less need. I mean, I think diversification is a good thing for welfare reasons, for political reasons. I love diversification in principle. But if I was purely looking from an economic perspective, I would say that Saudi's need for diversification is much less than most other countries because it has such cheap oil. It's always going to be able to profitably export it. Even if none of it is burned for energy or internal combustion engines, demand for products made with petroleum, that's, I think, going to be with us for a long time.
Okay, brilliant. What do you think there's a link between oil dependency and immigration? If you're looking at a lot of the states within the Middle East, you might take Qatar as an example. As a percentage of the workforce, there's a high percentage of immigrants. So obviously the Middle East known as sort of the primary region for oil production, oil exportation. So is there a link there, or is that just sort of a random occurrence, if you will?
There's certainly a link. And it's interesting because there's an irony here, because of the world's major industries, I think oil is by far the most capital intensive, that is, it uses the least labor for every dollar generated. And so it is not an industry that's going to draw in a lot of workers because of the industry. It's an industry that may promote immigration to fill service sector jobs that locals don't want to fill. Why? Because countries like Qatar have gotten so wealthy that citizens can get a government job or find some other government-related niche. It's very, very lucrative. Nobody wants to take on a service sector job, much less for a sort of competitive wage. And so to fill those jobs, they have this, secondary market, this market that's staffed almost entirely by immigrants. And those of you who've had the pleasure to travel in the Middle East, around the Gulf region, which I have, and it's wonderful to visit. Can see anytime you go to a commercial establishment, it's overwhelmingly staffed by immigrants, non-citizens, typically without rights, but immigrants.
Okay, again, another really interesting answer. Thank you very much. In a sort of similar vein then to that, do you think there is a link between oil dependency and the imperial legacy? So, I mean, again, that original slide that you had showing the top 30 countries based on oil dependency, a lot of them were located in Africa and the Middle East and North Africa. So again, these are the countries most sort of touched by European empires. Is that oil dependency today a product of the nature of how they were run in colonial days and sort of the focus of the economies back then?
It's a fascinating question. And clearly, in many cases, yes. The sort of twin histories of colonialism and oil exploitation are so closely wrapped together and so fascinating. And it is certainly, I think, the case that, for example, in the Middle East and Iran, Iraq, places whose boundaries were in fact drawn specifically so that, in this case, France and Britain could continue having access to their oil and control their oil. Yes, everything about their economies is reflecting that colonial history. In Africa, it's a little bit different. Certainly, in many cases, the oil production began. Sometimes it began under colonial rule. Sometimes it began after the end of colonial rule, but tends to be dominated by companies from the former colonizer, and so colonial ties come in a very big way. So it's a fascinating question. There's so much to say about it and think about it, although we're out of time. But I hope whoever asked the question is looking into it more deeply, because it's a great question.
Okay, brilliant. Well, as Michael said, we are in fact out of time. So I'd like to thank Michael very much on behalf of the Oxford Economics Society for providing such an insightful talk. I, for one, found it really interesting on a topic I didn't know masses about prior to this, and have really got a lot of benefit out of it. So thank you very much, Michael. As I said earlier, join us on Friday at 5 o'clock for Professor Richard Wolff, again talking about the crises of US capitalism. So again, what should be a fascinating talk. So once again, Michael, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all on Friday.